This is lecture number 9, where we're looking at resource usage and efficiency of resource usage in the construction industry. Here we're going to be talking about sustainability, management of resources, the procedures around reporting, environmental hazards, and compliance issues. So by the end of this lesson, you're going to know some of the current legislation that is linked to resource usage and efficiency. There are plenty of bits of legislation that are all interwoven here, but I'm only going to show you a couple. We're going to know about the reporting obligations that exist around environmental hazards. I'm hoping you will understand the role of the EPA and the local council in regulating environmental issues, and you're going to complete part C of the assessment task. So let's get started. Current environmental issues. When we're talking environmental issues, we're talking about any sort of impact that the construction industry can have on the environment. Some of the things that we do may be positive, some of them may have negative effects, and we need to talk about both the positives and the negatives and talk about how we can make our industry more sustainable for the future. So when we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about that ability for our resources to continue to exist for future generations. We know that we have a finite number of resources that exist in the world, a combination of renewable and non-renewable resources, and we need to make sure that we don't use all of them in our generation. We also need to think about things like waste management, how we manage the waste that is produced from construction projects, and whether we can sort and recycle or reuse some of those materials. We also need to think about the energy and the resources that we use, and whether those resources we use are being used efficiently, e.g. not wastefully. We need to think about the way that we manage water resources, the way that we manage fire, natural resource management in terms of trees, okay? And we also talk about conservation projects. So let's get started. We've got environmental responsibilities. Our goal is to minimize environmental risks and maximize opportunities to improve the environmental performance and promote more efficient production and consumption of natural resources on the worksite. For example, we can do this by minimizing our waste or through participating in or using a waste minimization system. Now, using resources efficiently includes reducing the materials that we actually use and also considering whether the energy and water use is efficient by doing things like testing the pipes to make sure that there are no leaks, to make sure we have fixtures and fittings that are efficient. If I'm thinking about installation of a shower, for example, making sure it has a WELS star rating. I know my shower delivers 9 litres per minute, which is the current recommendation. Having efficient fittings, insulation in the house to manage heat control and cooling. Managing the project site to make sure that we're managing stormwater and stormwater runoff, pollution to the stormwater system. Making sure we're using our materials strategically, thinking about our cuts before we do them to reduce offcuts and therefore to reduce wasted materials. Keeping our tools in good repair, e.g. doing regular maintenance, so we don't have blunt tools that are working too hard and using too many resources. Thinking about the way we transport our waste and the environmental issues associated with transportation, as well as all those alternative practices, procedures, materials, or products that we could use to eliminate or try and reduce the consumption of those natural resources. Now, some of the ways that we can achieve these environmental responsibilities to look after those resources is to follow standard operating procedures and to follow work instructions. Now, the way that we do things, the standard operating procedures, is normally documented by big companies. Smaller companies, it might be held just in the brain of the people that are working in those companies, but the way we do things has a dramatic impact on the amount of resources we use. And so by changing our procedures to be more efficient, we can have dramatic impacts, positive impacts on the environment. We also need to talk about the processes around reporting environmental issues. There is a legal requirement to report major issues relating to the environment, and there's a whole heap of people that we need to report that through to, and I'll go through that in some further slides. And lastly, we also have a responsibility as construction workers to keep records of incidents and accidents around not only safety issues, but also environmental issues. And we should also keep good records around the inspections or audit processes that we do to make sure we are complying with those environmental legislations. So let's get started then and let's look at legislation. The first one I'm going to show you is the PEA, the Protection of the Environment Act. Okay? Sometimes you see it called as the POTE, Protection of the Environment Act. This is a New South Wales specific piece of legislation from 1997. The aim of this one is to make sure that we protect, restore and enhance the quality of the New South Wales environment. It's not a construction industry specific piece of legislation. This one is for New South Wales, and the goal of it is to look after and improve the New South Wales environment. It consolidated a number of existing acts to try and simplify it and to build a regulatory framework for the protection of the environment in New South Wales. And it basically broke down the environment offences into 3 single tiers. So in a tier 1 offence, this is probably the most serious one you can have, and it's covering things like disposal of waste, major leaks, spillages and other escapes of different chemicals or substances into the ozone, into the waters, into the airs, whatever it might be. Tier 1 offences are offences where there is proof of willfulness or proof of negligence and that there is a harm or a likely harm to the environment. Okay, so you knew that something was going to cause harm to the environment and you let it happen anyway. It's a tier 1 offence. Now, tier 1 offence carries some pretty significant penalties. If you work for a company, it's a $5 million fine or $1 million for an individual, and it can also be 7 years imprisonment for the individual if it was proved that it was committed intentionally. If it was just an act of negligence where you didn't think of the option of the environmental disaster, you did nothing, but you didn't know about it because you didn't go out of your way to do the appropriate amount of research, so negligence, it's a $2 million fine for a company or $500,000 for an individual, plus potentially 4 years in jail. Okay, so that's tier 1, that's the most serious offence. Tier 2 are the middle level offences. These are all of the other offences under the Act and under the regulations. They include things like polluting the water, polluting the air, land pollution, noise pollution offences, etc. These are categorised as strict liability offences. And basically what that means is you don't need to be prosecuted to prove your intent. Okay? The expectation was that you considered water pollution and air pollution in your processes, and therefore, if you fail to comply, it's a tier 2 offence. Tier 2 offence could be $1 million for a company or $250,000 for an individual. And if it continues to go on for many days, you can even have daily penalties of $60,000 for an individual per day that the issue is not resolved. So we're talking really big fines here. The maximum penalty for this general littering offence is what's called 20 penalty units, but it basically works out to be $2,200. Okay, that's for just throwing rubbish out on the ground. The following offences were introduced into this Act, and it includes things like emission of an offensive odour from some sort of activity that you were doing, the unlawful transport of waste, or failure to comply with a duty to notify certain pollution incidents. So if you forgot to notify people or you failed to notify people of an environmental issue, that would be a tier 2 offence. Okay? If you were illegally transporting asbestos material without notifying the relevant agencies, okay, that would be a tier 2 offence. Tier 3, they're not separate offences. It's tier 2 offences that basically you can be given a infringement notice or a penalty notice for. Okay? It's like an on-the-spot fine instead of going to a large fine and court proceedings. The penalty cannot exceed the maximum penalty imposed by a court. Okay? So the maximum penalty is the most amount from tier 3. So you will remember that it was $5 million for a company or $1 million for an individual for tier 1 offences. Tier 3 penalties can't possibly be higher than that. So those tier 1s are the maximum penalties that exist. Tier 3 have to be equal or lower. These offence penalty notices okay, can be issued by EPA officers and the staff of other public authorities, things like councils, for example. However, the EPA is the main body that reviews them all. So if the council has issued a penalty notice and the EPA thinks it wasn't needed to be handed out, the EPA can withdraw it if it considers it appropriate. So Tier 3 are all of those separate things from Tier 2 that are actually on-the-spot fines. Things like having your soil running into stormwater, or having mud leaving the work site because you haven't had appropriate cleaning procedures in place from the truck tyres. Now there is another bit of legislation, that's the Protection of the Environment Operations Amendment Act in 2005. This is also New South Wales legislation, and it was just tightening up a few different things to the previous legislation. So it's just an amendment. It covers things like issuing notices, noise, smoke, some classification around the different water areas that exist, so tablelands, lakes, beaches, streams, rivers, etc. Covers things like the authorised officers and what powers they have, and other random little bits and pieces, or what we call miscellaneous matters. Okay. The EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, is the main regulatory authority for all of the serious things that are happening under the environmental legislation. Any construction work that is being done by a state or federal organisation or authority, so if it's a council-based activity, is all covered under the EPA. If it's an activity that's in relation to needing a licence, then it's covered under the EPA. For all things that are not covered in Schedule 1, so those major projects for the federal and state public-based projects, or for licensing related projects, all other ones, the regulatory authority is actually your local council. Okay, so the EPA and your councils control a similar role, just depending on the type of work that is being done. Schedule 1 is very detailed in the types of work that the EPA is responsible for, but as a guide, it sort of includes primary industry work, so agriculture, coal, iron ore production, timber milling, roads, railway, petrol and mining. So the really big primary industries. But when we're looking at those secondary industries, like housing construction, it's not usually covered under Schedule 1. Therefore, your local council is your regulatory authority. Now they're looking out for environmental hazards. Now environmental hazard is any substance that is dangerous to living things in the environment. So if it's dangerous to humans, to animals, to plants, or to the water. If it's dangerous to one of those things, then it is an environmental hazard. And it could include not just whether the thing is released into the environment, but also the storage processes around certain substances, like toxic, corrosive, flammable, or explosive substances, as well as infectious and other dangerous characteristics. So it's not just about how those processes are being managed, but also how they're being stored, particularly for those really dangerous substances. Okay, the Protection of the Environment Act covers a lot of those as well, making sure that they are being stored appropriately in compliance with the requirements to make it safe for the individuals living in that area. Now there are some reporting obligations. Okay, I mentioned this at the start of the slide, but when there is an incident, you have a duty to notify under the Protection of the Environment Act any pollution incident that has occurred during your work that can either cause or threaten harm to the environment. The people that need to report, okay, so if you are the person that is doing the activity and then there's a pollution incident, you have a duty to report. If you are an employee or an agent that is doing the activity that has released some pollution, you have a duty to report. If you are the employer, so you're the boss of the person doing the work, you also have a duty to report. Or if you occupy the premises, okay, the location, the building, the job site where the incident occurs, you have a duty to report. And it specifically says, similarly to how the health and safety reporting processes to Safe Work Australia, Safe Work New South Wales work, it says notification must be given immediately, e.g. promptly and without delay after the person becomes aware of the incident. So if a worker comes up to you and says, Hey boss, we've had an accident and we've got petrol leaking into the stream. Your first thing that you need to do isn't to try and get the petrol out of the water yourself. The first thing you need to do is you need to report it. And part of those reporting procedures includes letting the relevant authorities know. Now, in a case like petrol leaking into water, you might start with Fire and Rescue New South Wales to let them know. They are one of the relevant authorities that you need to notify when there is an incident. Now, there are a whole heap of different relevant authorities. So you've got what's called the ARA, the Appropriate Regulatory Authority. It could be your local council, might be the regulatory authority, or like we said earlier, it could be the EPA. Notify the Ministry of Health, notify Safe Work New South Wales, notify your local council, okay, if they're not already your ARA, and then you notify Fire and Rescue New South Wales. Now, just because you need to notify these people does not mean that there aren't any other obligations you might have. Okay, so for example, just because you've notified all of these different agencies doesn't mean that there might be other notification procedures that exist under the Safe Work Act, and you would need to comply with both acts if you have an incident that's encroaching on both different areas of the law. Okay, so making sure that you're letting people know, letting the right people know when something goes wrong. Now, I mentioned earlier that there can be infringement notices. Okay, these are penalty infringement notices, or what we call PINs. And PINs are being issued under the the PTEO, Protection of the Environment Act. Some things that they're being issued for are things like not having your site maintained properly. That is, not having your sediment control fences, not having your sandbags around the stormwater drains to divert mud and silt from going into the stormwater system. Okay? And if you're issued one of those, it could be a cleanup notice, could be a notice fee, or could be a prevention notice, okay, depending on what you have or haven't yet done. So PIN is a penalty infringement. Okay, these would usually be for things like your Tier 3 offences, so those low-level offences, okay, penalty infringement notices. They're issued by your appropriate regulatory authority. Most cases that's your council, unless you work for the government or you're working in primary industries and you're covered by the EPA. So we now then look at a specific company. So I've got CSR here. CSR is one of our big construction companies in Australia. And we're going to have a look at some of their reports around sustainability and what they are doing to try and reduce the impact that they have to the environment. So they've set themselves some goals around the amount of waste that they're sending to the dump, or to landfill, as we call it. And you can see that over the last couple of years, there's been a dramatic drop in the amount of rubbish that they are sending to tips. Now, naturally, you're going to see little things like the 2017-2018 year was slightly higher than the year before. Well, you've got to consider that the rate of production might have increased. So you can't just look at these numbers and say, oh, they didn't do very well that year. If they've got more production, more construction work that they're doing than they originally expected, then of course they're going to be slightly above prior years that might not have been as busy for them. They've got targets around the amount of waste that they're sending to dumps, targets around the amount of emissions that they have, the energy consumption that they're having, and the amount of water that they're using. And by setting these targets, they then put actionable plans in place to try and achieve them. And you can see more specific details in the sustainability report. Click on the sustainability report, it will open up a PDF document, and you can go down to the environment chapter in that report, and you can see some of the specific strategies that this company has undertaken to try and minimize their impact on the environment. Now, as a big company, they play a really big role in the overall impact on the environment, but each of us in our small little companies still play a big role as well. You've got to consider that even in the small construction side of a house on a single block of land, the impacts to the environment include the materials that you're using, the waste, whether you're recycling or reusing any materials where possible, but also things like your sediment runoff, okay, running into stormwater drains and into the oceans and into the rivers, depending on whether you're looking after your site appropriately. Now, you will recall from our Read and Interpret Plans unit, we looked at a whole heap of strategies around how those wastewater management systems work when we looked at the different plans. And I've linked those in to our Canvas site as well that has all of our resources for this unit. Now, I mentioned earlier on there are reporting obligations around the different types of environmental issues that occur. And you can see that for CSR, the number of incidents, minor incidents they've had, has dramatically decreased. Okay? It means they've put in strategies in place to try and reduce some of those minor incidents. Now, the goal would always be to have no incidents that need to be reported on. But the reality is sometimes things go wrong, mistakes might be made, whatever it is, and you do have that duty to respond. You can see that in level 2, there was pretty much a steady number of significant incidents that have occurred over the last couple of years. And so as a company, they would be looking at strategies around why do we keep having these significant and serious incidents, and what do we need to do? What practices do we need to change? What work processes do we need to change to try to make sure that our impact on the environment is as minimal as possible? Okay? And again, there's some more information in their sustainability report if you want to go and have a look at how they've done that. So I guess then the question is, how do we get the data around how much of our resources we use and the impact that we have on the environment? Well, I guess we need to use a combination of techniques and a combination of tools. Firstly, if we look at techniques, we need to think, well, I know how many materials are on my site because I can go and look at all those materials that I've got, and I can do some observation around how much of those resources are being used, how much is being thrown in the bin, etc. I could look at the invoices coming in from suppliers to work out how much of the different resources I'm using. So how much sand, how much aggregate, how much cement, how many bricks, how much timber, etc. I can also then measure whether my resource usage changes under different conditions. Do I use less resources in housing projects or in commercial projects? Do I use less resources in summer or in winter? Do I use less resources during rainy periods or during dry periods? So you can consider all of those different conditions as well and see if there's a way that you could minimize your wastage. Doesn't mean that I wasted a whole heap of timber because we went through a rainy patch and all the timber was damaged. Well, do I just need to consider covering the materials to protect them? Okay. And then we can also monitor any relevant information and data, things like the weather patterns and weather charts, and all other sorts of information around winds, around temperatures, around humidities, etc. So there's a whole heap of techniques for getting that information. Then to actually use it, okay, what tools do we use to collect it? We can use checklists. We can go through and tick off how many of each resources we have, doing things like stock takes, okay, using stock control software. We can present it as graphs, store it in databases, to try to get an understanding about the amount of materials that we are using, and compare it to the amount of product we are producing. Okay? Now, this is a lot easier for the big companies because they can have entire departments or teams working on collecting this. But even for a small company, you've really got to consider, if you just have a look in your bin at the end of a project, how many good resources are being thrown away that could actually be reused? How many bins do you have on site? And are you recycling them, or recycling the materials and separating it into its different parts to reduce the amount of waste that you're sending off to landfill? Okay, so these are some of the things to be considering. I've got a video here. While it's made specifically for Texas in America, the principles are pretty much identical to what we think about in Australia when we're thinking about stormwater management and the environmental requirements. I think it's worthwhile having a watch of that. It does go for a little bit of time, so you might want to watch it at the 2 times speed so that you can get through the information a little bit faster. But very valuable in terms of the different strategies that are used to manage wastewater and stormwater during construction projects. And lastly, there is another video there at the end of those slides around the waste that's being used from construction and how it is being recycled using a company called Veolia. This is a company that I believe is American based, but we also have some of them in Australia. They're quite a big company in Australia as well. So the principles remain the same or similar to what a lot of environmental waste disposal companies use in Australia. Okay, so have a look at those two videos. Having done that, you should now be in a position where you can go to Part C of your assessment task and you can look at the Boral Sustainability Report and start pulling out some information around the penalty infringement notices, why they've had penalty infringement notices, and the sorts of strategies that they're implementing to try to reduce their impact on the environment. Thanks very much.